Ben Sawyer, today's speaker, comes with a rich experience in developing serious games. He's written over half a dozen. He's also been the prime catalyst in the space of serious games, organizing conferences and meetings with the influential folks in DC to try to make more and more things happen in this space. Ben Sawyer also is a avid game player, and he has lots of great examples. So let's welcome Ben Sawyer. Thank you.
Okay, can you all hear me? Great. I think you can. So my talk today is basically just titled Serious Games 2.0. This is sort of not necessarily meaning this is the second coming of serious games as much as this is sort of the second great roundup of sort of information and kind of definition of the space and what we're talking about, and sort of second round of evangelization of what is going on in the space that I call serious games. And we'll just see if my computer's going to be nice and respond and do all kinds of good things. Okay, so about me, I am a lifelong gamer. That's the first bullet point that I want you to know. I used to play people in Pong and for quarters, and I kept the piggy bank right next to me to make sure they didn't realize that they had been scammed. That was my first entrance into gaming, and it kind of stuck with me all the way through. And it's sort of interesting that it's come full circle, and I'm working on a space that involves sort of games and a little bit of government and politics, since I grew up the son of two lawyers who were basically campaign managers. So life has a strange way of working out, huh? So I have this big interest in emerging technologies and what it allows people to do, especially small organizations and individuals, and obviously the internet, Web 2.0, e-commerce, all of those things I think are great. And I think basically computers are really at the heart of a lot of that. The sort of democratization of capability that desktop computing gives people is something to me that is very important. And what I then went on to, and in terms of spent a lot of time in emerging technologies, things like MP3, e-commerce, and other things, but always just loved games. In 1999, the Sloan Foundation had a project called Virtual U, which was a game-based simulator of a university. They wanted to, they had a grant program that was designed to sort of improve the management of the nation's universities, thus improving all subsequent output, be it scholarly or be it research or otherwise. And they thought maybe combining an idea like SimCity with an idea like university management would be a kind of an interesting, provocative way. They, as Jesse Ausubel at Sloan will tell you, he's like, I could have funded another book for a lot less. It would have taken almost as long. Books like this aren't exactly easy to write. And he says about 2,000 people would have read the book. And so I wanted to try something different. And through one way or another, he came to my doorstep when they were about 75% the way through, and he said, here's this game, we want to do it. We've got Trevor Chan, who had done capitalism, Bill Massey, who used to be the CFO at Stanford University, doing the modeling, and I was sort of the recruited producer for that. And that was before we were calling anything serious games. We were just, game-based simulation. This is what we were just kind of throwing around at the time. Got that out. It did kind of, it had an interesting life, still does, and I basically from that got a sort of trial by fire of what we would consider a serious game project from almost near start to absolute finish, including a second go-around where we updated the product. Dave Rajewski at the Woodrow Wilson Center was interested in looking at games for foresight and governance, which is sort of his great job. I think he might actually be one of the only people in DC working on that. But he noticed that his son could play Age of Empires and sort of make long-term decisions over a 100-year span in that game in a more interesting and an effective and an intuitive manner than he was seeing in many of the government administrators he would meet with. And he said, there's just something here that we should be able to do. I mean, he had just finished working on a project team that had done a 100-year plan for NASA. I mean, we have to make certain decisions today if we want to have certain incredible outcomes 100 years from now. And this is not something that many of us are used to doing. I mean, how many people are going to be around in 100 years, and how many people are going to be around in the same job 10 years, and are you willing to make those types of decisions now? And these bucks tend to get passed, but not in a sort of game, so perhaps you could package it. He came to me and brought this idea to me, and we were talking about how we could do this, how we could get the government, besides the military, kind of interested in these ideas. And we cooked up this thing that we called the Serious Games Initiative, because the feedback from Virtual U and from other elements of information that we were putting out from the Wilson Center were sort of founding that there was a lot of collective interest in this. There were other people doing some interesting work. There were other people sharing these same sentiments. And one thing that was common in all the communications was nobody was actually talking really heavily to each other. And it was sort of like there was a tribe that existed, but they didn't know about each other. So we sort of reinvented this idea, this initiative being sort of a grassroots networking capability. Moving on, we founded Games for Health out of that because we saw a lot of interesting work in health and healthcare. And then in terms of my bio, I've now morphed into doing a lot of private game design, innovation consulting in serious games, and project advisement. Here's some of the games that I've worked on. I can talk about any one of them, but I won't do it right now. The one in the lower left-hand corner is a game that we did for Cisco to help their networking academy students learn binary math. So it's basically sort of like a sort of casual puzzle-like game to learn binary math. There's some stuff on healthcare simulation and otherwise. All working with game developers, commercial game developers, and trying to package and build things that look, feel, and act like games. Just as a small announcement, tomorrow we're doing an event for our Games for Health project at the Hotel Decca over in Brooklyn Avenue in Seattle. It runs from 9 to 5:30. If you'd like to go to this, just send an RSVP at seriousgames.org. We still have some space left, and this is sort of a day-long meetup sharing information about what's going on specifically in health and healthcare. It's by no means a comprehensive look. We'll be doing that in May 2008 at our fourth annual Games for Health conference in Baltimore, Maryland. So today, I'm really going to talk about serious games, what we call serious commercial off-the-shelf. This would be the reappropriation of a commercial off-the-shelf game by an individual for some purpose other than entertainment, mostly a lot of teachers taking things and repurposing them. The sort of commercial side of serious games, where we're seeing things like Nintendo Brain Age, Wii Fit, and other types of applications that are coming right directly from publishers and game platforms for purposes beyond entertainment. Some of this sort of interesting byproduct that's being generated by gamers themselves. What are they doing with games that are taking them in different directions than they were originally intended? And then a little bit of a wrap-up on how some of this is also sort of manifesting itself in the sort of burgeoning advergaming field, marketing with games, and the sort of emergence of a sort of game culture block, the way you might look at it like sort of extreme sports and snowboarding were like 10, 15 years ago, and how that's actually creating a lot of byproduct in and of itself in terms of cultural identity and brands associating with that cultural identity for no purpose than to sell you stuff. So let's just talk about serious games. I always try to start off most of my talks saying that all games are serious. I've had a lot of game developers come up to me and say, oh, well, if you're serious games, then what the heck are we? And of course, it's sort of a branded kind of thing that we're just trying to get across to people who think all games aren't serious. So why could you be doing anything useful with a game, especially a video game? So as a way of kind of making sure that we don't use one thing to beat back something else and create another problem, I really do want people to understand that all games are serious, and that while I'm going to spend 99% of my time talking about serious games, I think that if we didn't have games and we didn't use them to entertain ourselves, we wouldn't be human if we didn't want to be entertained and told stories and spend time that was leisure. Some quotes. These are some just nice quotes that I like to pick out that sort of reinforce this kind of conceptual framework. I mean, John Dvorak, who we all think might know something about computing, maybe some days, maybe not others. It has this quote that I found one day: real progress in desktop computing always stems from gaming. And I think this does. I think most of us as desktop computing experts would say that there's definitely some truth in that. And that Tom Clancy has a character in one of his books, and Tom Clancy did start a video game company, has a character say to another that the smartest programmers don't work for Uncle Sam anymore, they develop video games. And again, sort of showing up in sort of a pop culture sense. This is what I'm going to spend this is sort of a chart that I put together to kind of spend some time illustrating what we're kind of dealing with. So down here we have entertainment and gamers, and up here we have non-entertainment users. This would basically be anybody using who might be exposed to some of the output from the serious game space, but who aren't really a gamer. And in some ways, what this is meant to say is that as we move away from actual games and going towards entertainment and gamers, where we're in commercial gaming, with game developers, sort of all coalescing here. As we move this way, we're kind of moving more towards mass market, sort of general usage for things like learning, modeling, and simulation, traditional educational software. But up here we have like sort of the commercial serious space where you're getting retail and you're going after sort of non-entertainment users with things like BrainAge and Wii Fit and Yourself Fitness. In between, you've got these people sort of repurposing traditional computer gaming titles in a sort of serious context. Here would be where you're getting your more Virgin style development, which is sort of building off of the modeling and simulation space, but is trying to find some sort of equilibrium between that kind of more drier usage and and technologies and concepts that are emerging from both commercial gaming and also gameplay. I mean, this is sort of another way of looking at game players as well. And then kind of as you move across here, what we're dealing with is the instructors and utilizers of these things. These would be more the producers. This would be more people who are appropriating this production and putting it to use in some new way. And then also the difference between sort of an enterprise influence mentality and a game influence mentality. So the enterprise influence mentality would sort of lean more towards e-learning, and a game influence mentality would start to come into the commercial gaming serious stuff and sort of avid gaming cultural capability. So what we're trying to do is in some of our recent work on the initiative and some stuff we're doing with University of Central Florida is try to build out some of the taxonomy and sort of illustration of the space to give it a better definition than what you may have heard of so far. And if you want to ask a question, you can stop me, but I've got a bunch of slides. I'm going to try and race through some of this. This is another way of also looking at the space and kind of what's happening. Sort of the game industry is sort of very driven by audience. It's both bringing an audience to these concepts, but it's also fueled off that audience desire for better graphics, better technology, better narrative, and just the sheer amount of money this audience is dumping into the technologies and the concepts and the research and development coming out of gaming. On the research, sort of traditional research side, you would sort of be pulling a lot of the basic theories of learning, cognition, sort of in between, a sort of shared sense between commercial gaming and research would be the emerging practice of game studies. On Web 2.0, you're sort of bringing in social networking, collaboration. You could kind of put e-learning down in here, which is mostly a web-based sort of framework. Over here in industry, we have that, again, traditional modeling, simulation, and visualization, kind of combining with commercial gaming, especially around technologies, computer-human interface design. All of this sort of as various streams that are pouring into this, put ourselves at the center of the world in this case, pouring into this sort of platform and emerging practice of combining these things into things that we would call serious games or serious game projects. I want you to understand a few things about serious games today. One of the important things that is to sort of get a very basic definition, and really it's the use of game-related resources for purposes other than entertainment. I try to keep it fairly general, and you'll see even further a reason for that. But I always like to, somebody just said to me one day, what do you really mean? I just said serious games are just solutions to problems. This is problem solving using the resources that we have. It's just the problems that we're being asked to solve in this regard are just not entertainment oriented. Okay? EA calls up, they want to solve an entertainment problem. Washington calls up, they're not necessarily trying to solve an entertainment problem. They might be using entertainment. They might be using the technologies. But you can really look at it this way. Entertainment is still a problem for all of us. We all want great entertainment. We all want to know what we're going to do on a Friday night or something like that. But I mean, this is a pretty solved problem for games. I mean, as I like to say, sort of tongue-in-cheek, if you don't think games have solved entertainment, just go talk to a television executive. Ask them where a huge portion of their audience is going. This is, in the serious aspect of all of this is also in the purpose of it. A lot of times people make the mistake, and I see this even in articles and quotes and people talking, they create this sort of sense that the serious in serious games is about the actual content of the game. There's a game, I have a screenshot of it, but called Catch the Sperm. This is the silliest game you've seen. Basically, as Ernest Adams once described, it's the only game that he knows to his existence takes fully inside a woman's vagina. This is a game where basically you shoot condoms at oncoming sexually transmitted diseases and sperm. And the sort of moral of the game is that one sexually transmitted disease gets by and it's game over. And it's just a very simple avid gaming sort of piece put out by the Swiss AIDS Federation, completely silly game. You laugh while you play it, but a fairly serious purpose. The intent behind the existence of the game is what's serious. And that may seem like a sort of of course, right? But I see people make this mistake quite a bit. And it's also, even building on that, one of the bigger mistakes I see people make is that they say serious games is games for learning. Now that's a huge part. That's probably like the biggest part, or the part that everybody is really spending an enormous amount of time on. But I'm here to tell you and show you, and I will spend quite a bit of time saying that it is not just equal learning, and that many serious game projects themselves actually aren't games. And so let's look at that. Some non-game examples. This is an artist who takes data out of Unreal Tournament games and maps the data onto imagery based on the map she's made. And you can sort of squint and see sort of a woman's face with hair kind of coming off. And she has this site called Unreal Art. And we've seen things like data visualization, machinima, which is movie making with games, just using games as communication tools. I know people just hang out in World of Warcraft to talk to each other. They're not there to actually play or do anything. They're just talking to each other. Sony, iToy, Microsoft, Xbox both have cameras. They both have video chat. These are very actually inexpensive, accessible video chat systems. It could be good for, we've even hypothesized and looked at ways where we could look at rural healthcare, because the cost of the hardware and the interface and the accessibility in the home maybe already could be better than what you would get off a computer. Computer science issues like general purpose GPU programming is sort of something that you could find a lot of people are interested in that in the game space and understand those processing units quite well. Cultural outreach, interface challenges, and design. So again, sort of trying to kind of broaden your perspective of what's going on here. Here's just some non-learning examples. Virtual Heroes is doing some stuff with visualization of the human heart inside the Epic's Unreal 3 game engine. I have to learn how to use a laser pointer. This is a project that myself and a few game developers did for DARPA, just looking at could game developers come up with new and interesting ideas for interface design for next generation UAV management and control. Here you have a underwater scuba game that Breakaway was working on and got repurposed to look and see if it could be a sort of pain distraction environment for kids undergoing chemotherapy and other types of invasive procedures, painful procedures, spinal taps and things like that. This is an offshoot of the America's Army Game Project, which itself is a serious game for recruitment, but Virtual Heroes has repurposed this with the help of Sandia National Labs to do some live-action role-playing within a synthetic environment for the Special Forces for adaptive thinking and leadership. A lot of built-in assessment tools in this too. Very interesting project. Of course, Brain Age might involve learning in terms of, you can do some math and some other things, but really this is just sort of meant to be a cognitive exercise trainer, and it's just sold short of saying that there's a health benefit for it. Here, this is the London Eye that a group of architectural people have put inside Oblivion, and there's actually, I don't have it with me, but there's a film of a Spain-based architectural student who has put all of Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water beautifully rendered in the Half-Life 2 engine. So just experimenting with game engines as great, robust network environments for synthetic, for looking at architecture. As well as, you could think virtual travel. I mean, how many kids get to take a field trip in a first-person perspective to Falling Water? Very interesting. Okay, so it's not just software either. Here's the U.S. military. What's he got? Come on, you work here. That's a Microsoft gamepad. That's an Xbox controller. It's a wired one, of course, because if you're going to talk wirelessly to a UAV robot, you don't necessarily want to use something that can be that isn't encrypted. But here you see where they're reappropriating the hardware, and there's tons of videos online of the Wii controller being repurposed for purposes beyond playing Wii Sports. This is part of the taxonomy project that I'm doing with Peter Smith at UCF. We're really trying desperately to map out the space in a variety of different views. This is just one. You saw one earlier. But we're looking here across the top at sectors like health, gaming, training, education. I mean, these are the sectors, and these are the sort of various types of uses within those sectors. So looking at what does the government want to do with games for health? What's their big purpose for using it? And is there work going on here? This would lead to things like research maps, usage maps, and things like that. So the big thing to take away, I mean, we could spend all day talking about this, but the big thing to take away from this is, wow, there are a lot of very specific uses that we could start to either hypothesize or even document to use games. And I would just point out that the only time learning appears, at least explicitly, is right here, right? You know, the intersection between games for education and the education sector itself. Not that we're not using it for education and elsewhere on the map, but you can find things like Machinima in terms of like a marketing and communications firm maybe producing a piece of commercial advertising or storytelling using a game engine. Whoops, wrong way. Of course, if you doubt that that's just a map of hypotheses, here I've now mapped this actually to games and projects that I know about. So for example, a government or NGO might be using something like Darfur is Dying to bring attention to the space, to this issue to the public. Here's Incident Commander. This is a game that Breakaway Games has done where you practice the NIMS management protocol for mass casualty or big emergency responses such as school shootings. But one of the great things from this is you could actually get the system to watch your gameplay enough, look and work with you on producing an actual plan. So the idea would be you play the game and you get your localized planning done for you. So you would actually get an output from the game of what should be your protocol to follow. In terms of marketing and research, this is a budget prototype that the Wilson Center, myself, and Dragonfly are working on, where the idea is people play with the federal budget, and then as they do that, we're starting to get basic opinion research out of that. As opposed to calling people and asking them what they think or what they think, we can actually get a better sense of, in some cases, if we actually had them play a game where the consequences came out quite a lot. So again, we could spend all day on this, but what I want you to understand is with each box that's shaded in there, we have at least some level of activity, either an actual game or a project that's looking at it in a research space. So again, you can see not only is the space have wide possibilities, but there's a wide amount of action. And in many of these areas, actually, we could go 2, 3, 4, or 5 projects deep. This is another part of the taxonomy. Obviously, I do a lot of work in the healthcare space. Our goal is to eventually take this entire taxonomy and break it down even further into specific spaces using the same kind of approach where we're really trying to create a matrix where everything has a unique filled-in point and a unique identified citation of a project or research or other things. And as we go about this throughout the year, we think at the end of it we're going to actually be able to really map out the space both potentially and work involved, as well as use it to drive a really unique research agenda in terms of what types of development, what types of design research problems do we have, what types of cognitive and psychological research do we have that we need. I'm also asked quite a bit, what's the difference between game simulation and modeling, right? This comes up on the Serious Games listserv quite a bit. This is not necessarily the axiom that one should follow. This is just my own kind of observations, but I think they bring about them important lessons. One of which is that games we have to remember, most importantly, games are also a form of media. There are media practices going on within games that we don't necessarily associate with models and simulations. Now, models and simulations might sometimes exist as games, but games don't necessarily always exist as what we consider to be or recognize as models and simulations. Games by nature are often abstracted and sometimes try to be misrepresentative of their core subject matter so that they can deal with some of the issues of trying to make a game fun, trying to make a game ship on time, whatever it may be, trying to make it accessible to a large amount of people. The sort of practice is to throw things out, not throw more in. And sometimes to also bend the truth, much like movies bend the truth, right? I just watched 300, right? I mean, that's just so far from the truth, but it's truth to the spirit, or at least to the interpretation of the spirit through Frank Miller and others. Well, games come from that kind of background as opposed to, say, a simulation background as a practice, and so these sometimes are things that go on. Now, these can be seen as a strength or a weakness, depending on who you talk to, depending on the situation. But I don't think models and simulations are necessarily, they may be reduced, but I don't think they're purposely abstracted. I don't think the intention of people building models and simulations is to purposely abstract the way we do that in games. And so there are things that these groups can learn from each other, but we should start to recognize these differences so that we can see comparative advantage at times in either case. Because if we're going to ask games to be used for other things, and we're going to be kind of butting into these other areas of practice, we've got to kind of understand what are the strengths and weaknesses, what are the differences in the cultural approach of and the intent of the creators. But I think that one of the things that we get out of this is that models and simulations don't necessarily work well in issues where perception is good enough versus reality, depending on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to instill fear in someone, perception may be just as good. If you're scared, you're scared. I don't have to have like some sort of detailed progression of why you're scared. I don't have to have a detailed progression of that building blew up by calculating each physical aspect of the brick that got laid on the debris field. I mean, if I'm going to walk by this building and be in this sort of environment, as long as it looks like it and feels like it, I probably may be perceiving that. I don't have to worry about those issues as much in a game versus, say, somebody who might be trying to model a debris field to kind of figure out exactly, when is that debris field dangerous. Games are driven by user-centric design, and I think this is important because game design is built off the need to spur consumption. A lot of a lot of video games got their start as being quarter eaters. If you couldn't spur more consumption, then you are out of business. Same thing in the modern day console business. If you can't get your tie ratio to be high, if you can't get your platform out there, you're not going to survive. 6 weeks on the shelf and you could be done, and that's not great when you're risking millions and millions of dollars. This may not be the same modus. This may not be the same pressures that modeling and simulation are under. But I think it's also important to think of games versus games themselves. We're not talking about, in the serious game space, we're not often talking about role-play things that you do at work, the old pen and paper Dungeons and Dragons stuff. We're just not dealing with it. We're dealing, in this case, with software, and often a highly stylized version of software, but again, sort of drawing from that sort of media framework as well. And this media framework and what games are and how games are perceived by players today and the growing user base of games is important because they have expected conventions for this software. And so if you violate some of those expected conventions, say the graphical look and feel of a modern day video game, you better understand why, whether that's a strength or a weak, whether that's something you can get away with, how you're going to deal with it if you're not. I mean, these are the things that you have to deal with in this type of gaming versus, say, someone's exposure to other types of games, board games and otherwise. And importantly, I mean, again, sort of going back to the computerization standpoint, really talking about taking advantage of computation and in this case, in the modern day age, networking and Moore's and Metcalfe's law. And I think Ian Bogost, who was here before, talked a little bit about the sort of melding of computation in gaming. I'd just like to say that the CPU gave us single-player gaming, and that before computers came along, the ability to have really rich single-player experiences was really not that possible. You had to call up people, you had to bring them over to your house. You couldn't, I mean, solitaire, that's about it, right? You had to have people play. You couldn't enforce rules depending, how easy was it to enforce every rule? Oh, well, let me roll that die again. Come on, guys, I think that the CPU is what gave us, it gave us an important step in gaming. It broadened the audience because you could give people rich single-player experiences. It also deepened game design. Game design took on all kinds of other facets. And that grew over the last 30 years to give us sort of modern-day video games with incredible rich practices, rich design depth. And this is the area that we're now mining. Because when you think about traditional edutainment software or educational software that we saw in the 80s and early 90s and still see on the shelves today, the sort of math blasters, the Reader Rabbits, even a little bit of Oregon Trail, these sort of tended to take their cues from a game design standpoint from pre-existing board games, card games, or what I would even call classroom games. Today we're going to play Flash. We're going to play like you come up, you do them, I'll put a math problem, we'll pull two people up, and we'll do like math, math bee or spelling bees or geography bees, right? That's kind of what you saw get translated into a lot of early educational software. Today, when we think about building games, or at least myself and many of the peers in this sort of field rethinking serious games, at least in the learning context, we're sort of more inspired by things like Tetris or SimCity. That's where we're starting to source from in terms of looking for design patterns that we want to reapply in new ways. And I think the CPU is what caused quite a bit of that. So how did we get here? This is a long history of play for other purposes than entertainment. The Olympics, chess, and other things existed both for entertainment but also human performance issues. Then we had computer game. Flash forward many years, real quick, right? And then we got computer games, and out of that we sort of got the first wave of edutainment, and then we got this like refinement of computer games, which I think is where we're at now, which is what we're sourcing for sort of the next generation of games for purposes beyond entertainment. So you get SimCity, which got you SimHealth, but then, so you had some of these early, like 1980s efforts in sort of what you would call either games that could have sort of serious uses, or even in the case of SimHealth, a true serious game where game developer Maxis worked with John Hiles and worked to produce a game about the healthcare debate in 1993, funded by the Markle Foundation. But if you look in the literature, it's kind of interesting. Where things really started to get interesting is you started seeing people in the graphics sort of academic community and others and visualization communities talk about networked game engines, looking at what they could do with these new networked game engines that they weren't really getting out of things like VRML and traditional VR hardware. The fact that this was synchronized, fast 3D graphics and a little bit of physics, increasingly over time a lot more physics, but that was arbitrated for everyone who was playing over a sort of TCP IP network with latency and everything else. In fact, you can actually, if you go back and you look at the history of Doom and Quake and other things, they actually stumbled over a lot of latency issues and had a lot of initial problems getting these things to work. So they stumbled over many of the same problems that other people were still stumbling over, and they kept pushing at it and got to this point. And because these engines were moddable, you started seeing people saying, hey, I'm going to use this stuff. I'm going to start looking and playing with new ideas in visualization and graphics over here with the stuff that's coming out of these games guys companies, and not over here with these other technologies that aren't doing what I want. So you can actually see that in the literature, and from that then you started to get sort of a second wave of sort of serious games. I threw Virtual EU up there because I care about it. But America's Army, I think, and some of the MIT's Games to Teach project were sort of another wave. And America's Army is definitely, it's absolutely connected to this emergent stuff. And you can see people like Mike Zaida, who worked on America's Army, being part of the people who were really quick to glom on to the what was coming out of network game engines and what the possibility of that was. Mark Prensky wrote a book called Digital Game-Based Learning that got published, and that sort of put a new face on this a little bit and got it out into sort of business press. And then I think we followed up with the Serious Games Initiative, which sort of took this kind of trajectory and formed community around it, and that got us forward. In terms of the state today, I mean, Serious Games is growing from this sort of grassroots space to something more of a branded movement and field. It's not anything. It's not anything quite more than that. It's not a consortium. It's not this humongous field, but it's good, strong, and organic growth by everything that I can see in terms of people who are subscribing to our mailing list, coming to events, published pieces in journals and in magazines, and meetings we're regularly drawing up to 400 plus people, and so more and more people are just getting involved. But I mean, I'm not sitting here saying, oh wow, this is great, we were off and running and it's all solved. I mean, this is really experimental and emergent sort of practice. I mean, a lot of the work in this space is definitely prototyped form, and not all of it's all that great. There's been some nice funding. I mean, Robert Wood Johnson funded the Games for Health project. MacArthur has been pouring some money into this space in terms of digital learning. Pulse is a project that you may have seen earlier with the person lying on the gurney with a nurse attending to them, looking at 3D graphics and game design as the form for a simulation for combat medicine and emergency medical training. That's funded directly by Congress. Fortune 500 growth. These are companies that I can talk about who actually have done projects, and there's several others in those fields that I can't talk about. The sort of space, I peg it right now around 150 million if you fold in various commercial off-the-shelf related revenue. So that would be things like BrainAge, Wii Fit, Exer Games that are sold at retail, sort of get us up into this mark, at least from anything that I can track. This is not an easy field to track the way you can track video game sales through point-of-purchase sales. I mean, we can mostly have to kind of call around and talk to the companies that are doing it, talk to people who have been supporting projects, get a sense for whether their spending's going up and down, looking at government grants in the space. But I feel fairly confident about that number. It doesn't include the traditional edutainment or advergaming, which could be seen as serious games as well, because I'm looking at this sort of smaller, more important nucleus in terms of charting whether or not this is really progressing. We have groups in Japan, France, the UK, and Canada that have all started up, some with government support, some without, but they've all held meetings. Academic growth, Michigan State started a master's degree program in serious games. Coventry over in the UK has a whole serious games group going. This quote that I don't need to read completely to you is Bing Gordon sort of saying that about a third of the students that he meets now want to do games for public purposes. So these are the students in game design programs. And when I actually meet students in traditional modeling and simulation programs and talk to them, a lot of the design sort of language they use is game-like, as opposed to sort of traditional modeling and simulation talk. You know, they'll talk about levels and power-ups and things like that that they're embedding. So I've even said to the DoD, I've said, as much as you might want to sort of decide that that community isn't something you want to source to if I'm dealing with a skeptic, I'm like, you don't have enough capacity, human capacity in your traditional modeling and simulation shops to keep up with your demand. So you're going to have to use these kids coming out of these programs, and you're going to have to use game developers, whether you like it or not. You may be sourcing something completely different from it. But it's a very interesting thing going on at the actual student level that the industry, the game industry, and the modeling and simulation industry are seeing. And this may actually be the sort of hidden sort of force behind all of this as these students sort of graduate from these programs. Not all of them can go into the game industry anyways. There's just not enough jobs for the number of programs that are starting up across the country. Avergaming in terms of total revenues is off the charts, and commercial interest in this space is growing in terms of the commercial game publishers, companies like Microsoft, like EA, Nintendo. If you look at it from the non-industry standpoint, this is sort of where people outside of the game industry are kind of coming to the game industry saying, well, we want to use this exciting media form for our needs. We want to piggyback on everything that you're doing, especially on your investment in things like AI and graphics and interface and hardware. We want to build these new games, these new markets, because they're trying to say, you know, this entertainment business is getting kind of too competitive. And in fact, actually, the non-industry people who are saying this are actually government people, mostly overseas, because they're looking at their domestic game industry, which may be under assault because of the sheer economics of the industry, and they're trying to figure out, okay, where does that job growth go next? So you see the UK spending a lot of time, from a government standpoint, looking to develop a domestic serious games industry as a hedge against the cost of doing business in the UK for commercial game interests. So experimenting with new ideas for games, computer science and psychology, especially in terms of looking at those areas, and just games about different topics, meaning that people outside of the game industry coming to the game industry saying, I want to do games about topics like, you know, DARFR, and sort of seeing how they can mix those two together. Within the industry, they're really looking at it, I think, as a new market for their technologies, their human capital investments. How can they spread that across a wider field of practice, sort of smooth out those ups and downs in their business. This is especially true at the studio level, the independent studio who might have one big project with a publisher, then have a gap of 4 or 5 months before they're going to land that next contract. What do you do with all those, with all that payroll? Can you slot in something from a government grant or a commercial or a corporate group that might be spending a fraction but can cover that burn rate during those months? And then in terms of the marketing message based on alternative application of the output, you know, exercise, health, communications, and other things. So that's sort of a look as to how this sort of space is shaped. We'll talk a little bit about why I think this is happening. I think that this is a quote a friend of mine shared to me. She felt that games were a culture of interface. My question is sort of like, but an interface to what? What's going on here? And mostly games are an interface to geospatial representations. Find a map, find places on a map, fight for them. Find people on a map, shoot them, and or if you're not into the sort of war gaming and fighting and shooting, you get things like Civilization, SimCity. Look at a map, find places to build things, allocate resources across a map. We do this like really, really well. When I talk to DoD, military, to people, I say, you don't need me to come here and tell you that what we do in gaming is very similar to some of the geospatial issues that you deal with every day. But let's take a step back from this. Let's think about this story, right? This was, no offense to Zombie, they're based here in Seattle. They're a great group. I love them. They do some awesome work, great games, some great work in the serious game space. But this was a sort of project that the government or military contractor was asking them about, where the sort of idea where when IEDs were going off in Iraq, and they still are, one of the first responses were to sort of beef up convoy training, essentially to kind of teach the drivers how to spot things further ahead and avoid them. I mean, this is sort of a geospatial sort of answer to the IED problem. Find it with your eyes and get out of the way, or shoot it, or see it before it comes, right? And this is sort of like, it became like a game I called Spot the Carcass, right? Because they would actually embed these IEDs in a carcass. And that's sort of like, to me, that's like, okay, not great, because we do a lot of other stuff in gaming, and it's sort of like we deal with a lot of geospatial maps, but really where I think things get even more interesting is this idea of mental maps. And here's a great game, an old game called Hidden Agenda, which is really a mental map model of being a dictator of a sort of banana republic like country. I mean, there's no territory that you're explicitly playing. The only geospatial representation in this entire game is the man's desk. Everything else is this interaction with people and questions and dilemmas that you have to deal with, and whether or not somebody's giving you the right advice, whether or not this is the way you want to take this course of action. And frankly, we got away from a lot of these games as we came out of the 80s into the 90s and got into 3D graphics and other things. And I think that what these types of games do is they're sort of asking you, who are you? Not where are you? Now, it's not that we can't do these other, I don't want to bash all the geospatial sort of stuff that we can do. I'm just saying it's very easy to fall into the trap that's one of the big, that's what we're here for. And in fact, actually, this is the bigger upside, I think. So just as a sort of non sequitur, but a little bit on this, is sort of a friend of mine once got up at a military conference. She was giving a talk about games and other things that people were doing with it, and she just asked rhetorically to the attendees, which was better, satellites and predators to find things, or 100 kids with Flickr, Google Maps, and camera phones? Okay, are we going to train people to be adaptive and creative and strategic, or are we going to just train them to have certain skills with things and big technology? And where's the game player here? It sort of was the hidden message. Where does the game player want to play? What's the game player's answer? Where's the transgressiveness? Where's the creativity? Where's the sort of competition going on here? It's going on, I think, up in here. So, just the sort of thing to kind of wake us all up a little bit into the realities of things. But games are, so we hear games as a component of education. But what are these games? What's the component? What is the education? These are the sort of big questions that we're asking. And we don't have these answers completely. This is too new. But what's important about this is that the things that you're seeing and having and experiencing in the serious game space are just an answer or an attempt at an answer. And we really need to figure out how we actually embed games as a component to the educational process versus some of the sort of rhetoric that's been out there where they sort of see it as displacing the traditional educational process. How do we enhance it and augment it is what I see being the better approach to that. And sort of what kinds of games are we going to build out of this space, and how are we going to get beyond that sort of spatial representation? How are we going to get beyond applying computation to things other than just graphics? Not that we shouldn't be doing that as well. I love great graphics, and they have capabilities that that we need. But how do you get also beyond computerized arbitration is a big question in this space, because some of the things that we want to do in serious games can't necessarily be done with a computerized arbitrator, right? I made the point earlier that single-player gaming was great because the computer arbitrates it, right? But we don't want to just stand completely in that space. We want to look and see how can we deal with the computer or use the computer to arbitrate a situation where myself and Ross he's a corporate manager of one company negotiating with me over a merger, and I'm sorry, I know we're all working on natural language and all kinds of other things, but the computer cannot necessarily sit there and completely arbitrate if Ross goes, screw it. I don't like you anymore. What are you going to do about that? I'm going to actually, I'm going to go buy your competitor. I'm going to go buy another competitor as a jockeying position. I mean, a lot of computer arbitration in games is based off a closed possibility set. So one of the things that people have been experimenting with is sort of in a massively multiplayer existence, your peers are reviewing your actions. And we're giving them interface capability to do that. So the scoring system is an augmented scoring system by our peers. So as you're hearing Ross and I argue in this game space and making moves with what the computer offers us, the rest of you are going, Ross is doing better. No, you're doing better. And the computer's keeping track of that and giving us perhaps even a little bit of a numeric score based on how many people are voting, how often they're voting, all kinds of other things. And how do we move this sort of beyond learning? So what sort of component, is it going to be learning? Are we going to build these environments for practice or execution? I've made a point, actually, we had a project we were working on, I mentioned before, where we saw, wow, actually it's the same environment for all of this. And that the game actually became more of a work environment than a learning environment. Do we want to use these things in informal or formal contexts? Are we doing an abstracted model or a perfected model? These are things that in the serious game space we deal with every single day. And these are debates as well as they're just pure methods of execution. So are you doing this by yourself or for yourself? Are you doing this by yourself but with someone else kind of helping you, like a teacher? These are the different sort of component elements of it. And again, looking at where is the point of contact between the game and what it's being used for. And in terms of education, are we looking at doctrine? Are we looking at this being a part task simulator? Is it for leadership, teamwork, creativity, strategy? We're just skimming the surface of where we think these games can be a possibility. It's important also to think about, but what are games themselves? And I think that games are basically are patterns, and if you solve and you master the pattern is sort of the context of winning the game. That's usually the core premise of most game design. And the patterns are often abstracted, right? Asteroids is an abstraction of being in outer space, fighting your way through the Martian asteroid field. But you learn that pattern in a game of how to play it, what to shoot, when to shoot at things, and you reapply it in a greater and greater context. In asteroids, the context is more and more asteroids. So you learn to shoot them. Then the saucer shows up, right? So now you have to learn how to shoot, but now something's shooting back at you. So you're moving with this skill set into different elements where you're trying to reapply it. Same thing with something like Super Mario. First you learn to jump. Now I'm going to make you learn to jump against an enemy. Now I'm going to make you learn how to give you a puzzle where you have to double jump. So you're constantly taking a skill, reapplying it in a new situational framework. And these patterns themselves are often loose frameworks. But what's interesting about it, and what Jim G talks about and how what video games have to teach us about learning and literacy, I think is that these games sort of encourage you with these loose frameworks to think about them. And to give you frameworks that you can reapply. So you're really interpreting the framework, and you're not just sort of living in such a detailed environment that there's that the thinking's all being done for you. You're filling in that. But one of the other important things to think about with games is often these are they're sort of tricks, right? They're perceptions versus reality. The things that we're doing, such as if you meet a character in a game and you have a conversation with it, there are a lot of people who look at those types of games and feel like, God, that's a real person. But this is basically some nice sort of branching storyline, maybe with some algorithms for how the character reacts. Are they getting angrier based on your choices, or are they getting sadder? But they're basically sort of like nice, neat little sort of programming tricks built around this sort of, game that as much as anything is like theater. So why use a game at all? And we hear about the growing media form. We hear about people allocating time. I made that point earlier. But what we're really asking is, do games offer? And I think Marilia spoke about this a little bit yesterday. There are other people who will speak about this as well. It's just at times they may offer better forms of educational experience. I'm not one to say that this is a universally applicable rule. But there's certainly, we found with like the binary game, it worked better than a lot of other methods they were using. It had a flow to it. People could iterate through more problems. They felt like they had fun, so they would spend more time with it, and they would build up that sort of skill at basically being able to do binary math in their head. And Cisco will say, the producer at Cisco felt that was a better form of experience and the educational result that they were looking for than what they were doing before then. So, but that's like one small example, and Marilia gave more yesterday. But in general, I mean, this is the holy grail that researchers are searching for. They're trying to figure out, where are games better? Why are they better? When are they better? And the technologies and talent, though, in the game industry is really, where we're trying to source these from, because we see that they have capabilities beyond games. They can do incredible graphics. They can do some interesting forms of interactivity, and we're trying to pull those things out, identify them as comparative advantages, and put them to work. There's billions of dollars going into this, and if we think that the only output from that is a lazy Sunday afternoon, I mean, I just think that seems like an underestimation of what that investment is getting. So I feel that good games, sort of because of abstraction, because of patterns, I think that's, Marilia talked a little bit about this yesterday. I just like to say that I think this maps to the way our brain actually works. Recently reading, a lot about the brain and sort of the idea of chunking, associative memory, patterns, more senses involved at one time. That's what we are. That's what our brain is taking in. And that's how it's processing all of that. And that's what games are doing, right? They're patterns. They're sent to you in a sort of multimodal sense of sound and graphics, text sometimes. And so all of this is coming at you, feel with force feedback. And so it's a nice sort of media form that lends itself to the way the brain works. And this is sort of becomes this motivation aspect that gives you things like the interactivity, flow, emotion, the sort of carrot stick challenge, all of these things pushing you through that content, or putting you in terms of like a lot of the 3D stuff, into what people at some of the government labs like to just call thought space. A way to just put you in the middle of that problem and let that problem surround you and let you live within that world, that environment, and get a different perspective on it. And so it gives you that control over that environment. It gives you sort of a new way to look at things and the manipulation aspect to it. And so I think that when we use games often is to do that, sort of abstract them so we can understand them as systems, right? So Will Wright takes the whole idea of running a city and boils it down to 5-6 factors in the original SimCity, and gave an immense amount of people a chance to see the city as a working system, a system that had manageable parts, that had cause and effect relationships. Was it a perfect simulation of a city? Not even close. But close enough that we could now go out into the world and take that as a platform to observe cities in even greater detail. How many people after playing SimCity would drive by sort of a rough neighborhood that was around a sort of manufacturing district of that city and understand that relationship of property values and how it manifests itself into things like crime rates and other things? I mean, obviously a lot of other factors go into crime rate than are in SimCity, but I mean, how many people could have had that sense, or could start plugging in new factors that might be given to them by experts? So go play SimCity, come back to me, I'm an expert at running a city. Now I can actually have a framework that I can plug other things into, because you've gotten that better abstracted framework. It's an easier sort of thing. You have the sort of mailbox drops that I can start to fill in. And games themselves, now with the internet and massively multiplayer stuff, these are augmented by other resources, player guides, P2P discussions. So gamers are teaching other gamers how to play games and creating learning communities. There are richer learning communities going on around some video games than you might have around some topics on a wiki. So I'm going to run out of time, but we talked a little bit yesterday with Mayor Leah's talk about how this might deal with, sort of looking for a biological understanding, because of course in games and healthcare we're not going to get very far with the MDs unless we can start to kind of think about whether or not there's a biological underpinning of this. A lot of this, I will admit, is just literally theory and conjecture at the moment. But there are recent studies that were written up that I just saw recently in The Economist about 6 months ago that talked about lab rats who had learned something new, actually had new neuron growth and retained them versus a control group. This is sort of informing our sense of plasticity in terms of what the effect of learning is on the brain. Hope Lab's research director, they did a great product on learning, on helping kids with cancer who play a game become more informed about their cancer, as well as seeing it as a learning things like how to take your chemo longer so that you can battle down to the last cell in that game. They actually would find higher levels of chemo in their user population than they found in their control group, and we got into a longer discussion. I said, where are you trying to go with this? And he feels there's something going on in the limbic system with a good game, with the emotional aspect to it and how that is connected to learning. This is something that Mayor Leah discussed yesterday. This is, again, people playing around with these ideas, and I think there is some truth to this, because I do see that games and that sort of reward system that is built into games, and it's not a reward system that waits 3 hours for the reward. It's a reward system that's happening like every 30 seconds, let alone every 3 seconds, and there's different elements of reward. But I think that someday we might find out that games are actually sort of a dopamine regulator in some way, in the way they work, just the natural means of them working. I always have these nightmares of, like, game executives being hauled before Congress. Did you know that you were regulating dopamine? No. We didn't, we swear. And then in terms of some of the way the neocortex takes in information from the senses, chunks it, abstraction, I talked about that before. And then of course, we'll go back to spatial representation and orientation are important parts of the way the human brain works. And I don't think I have to tell you that that's a big part of video games. But, I've been building on a sort of positive note. Let's think about some of the negativity aspect. One of the things that we have in this space that we have to deal with is bad games really ruin everything. I'm going to build a great game to teach kids about nutrition. And this is going to be an awesome game, and because kids love video games, they're going to love this game, and they're going to play it, and then all of a sudden they're going to eat better, and we're going to end obesity, right? And then they make Catch the Fruit, just a horrible game, just a bad game, a bad design pattern, bad graphics, bad everything. They even do it with money. It's not just somebody working at home, and the fact is that is not going to work. A bad game is going to likely give you a bad outcome. Garbage in, garbage out. Except a lot of serious games are being made by people who don't necessarily have these skills. So we have to, not only are we trying to convince people that games have some sort of use beyond entertainment, but now we also have to deal with it. We have to make this excuse, but it's only the good ones. And making a good game is hard. I'm fond of saying, we make bad games in the game industry every day. Just open up PC Gamer, go to the back, you'll see about 4 reviews that get about 85 or higher, and then everything else gets trashed. 45s, 55s. I mean, we have a sort of a C average in the majority of the game industry through its critical assessment. But what's important in this sense with serious games is because there's so many unskilled people working in this. A lot of the people who are motivated to build these things are not necessarily game developers, and they might not necessarily have the budget to hire one or the interest in hiring one. They think they could do it themselves. They tend to make bad games because they make really obvious mistakes. Game developers, on the other hand, make bad games by somewhat making obvious mistakes, but often it's new mistakes or something that didn't quite work as well as everybody thought it might. But they're not making a mistake of saying, oh, well, we'll just do Catch the Fruit and this will work because it looks like every video game I played 25 years ago. Good projects can be forgiving of the circumstances and save bad games, and I think vice versa. And then we don't know what makes a good game. Okay? We could tell you what makes a good game based on a certain context. But what makes a good game, I mean, what would make a game about nutrition good? I mean, it's an open question. We don't have that answer. And people are I see people, I talk to people a lot, and they'll sort of be asking developers to talk about that question, and they'll look at literature and they'll look at other things. And I see them, and what is in their heart is the joy of cooking, of game design, so that everybody can do it. So I can go home and I'm going to take this book open and then I'm going to take my nutrition idea and then boom, I'm going to get a hit game. Or I'm not going to need a game developer to do it, which is crazy. I love movies, but I'm not writing a movie script any day. I try. It's really hard. So serious games, just to sort of finish on this, games, I do say they do work, whatever that may be. There are contexts where games have worked. They have served the purpose they were commissioned for. They've proved out on that purpose, whether it be a learning purpose, advergaming, games as a work interface, it could be. I mean, are they working across the board? Is everything magically in the form of a game suddenly give you this great result? No. But because we have this huge uncertainty of how, what, and when. But I do think we know about the who. And I just said it before. Game developers are where we're trying to source this from. And I plead with people who are listening and learning about this space. Think about the fact that this space is driven by what you see in commercial games. The richness of the skill set that went into making great games like Halo are what are motivating people to kind of come forward and say, I want to try this just for something different. You know, we could all play baseball. Everybody here probably knows how to play the basics of baseball. But we're not going to be the Yankees or the Red Sox. So you have to go to the who. And then, so we're driven by all these converging factors. We're increasingly about interface and psychology. And the activity gamut is probably, I think, one of the more misunderstood comments. Now, I'm getting it's time to be over bit, and I've run out. I just want to tell you a few things. We did a sort of COTS Boggle project to look for examples of off-the-shelf games being used in new ways. We had over 100 citations. I have some of these on the slides that will be distributed. And then who are the drivers of that? But we also had some stuff where we've gone out and we've looked at stuff that gamers are doing with games. They tend to do all these things that are on this slide. And what's interesting is if you look at the things that gamers are doing with games besides just playing them, they tend to be the same types of things that we're trying to think about doing with serious games. In fact, it's important to repeat that I think that serious games in some ways, in this context, are just a focusing and amplifying and an acceleration of the things that we're already seeing in game byproducts by the users themselves. And so we have these sort of serious gamers who go out and do things like get really good at games from a human performance standpoint. This person, who I'll skip over, built an actual music sequencer using the Guitar Hero controller so he can actually play real music with it. This person does photography and Counter-Strike, so this is actually showing signs of composition and other things that you would teach in photo class. Of course, we see teaching in games, people teaching other people how to play games better, how to be a better guild member. This person built a map of all of World of Warcraft inside Google Maps with the Google Maps API. I mean, just the amount of work that went into that, I think, is just incredible. Communication and socialization goes on. Protest and activism. This is a person who protests America's army by typing in the names of dead soldiers and their date of death into the game while people are playing it as a sort of protest against the idea that it's being a recruiting tool. This person made a machinima of the French riots to get the story out because he felt the mass media was actually misrepresenting the story. So he used Activision's The Movie to make a movie about it, and it had over 1 million downloads. We'll skip over games and work. Just in terms of commercial serious, Pedometer, that's available, a pedometer game that also plugs into the Nintendo DS where it acts as a diary of all your work. This is a new game out in Japan for eye training, eye exercise on the DS. This is some output from Square Enix, makers of Final Fantasy, doing a project with a textbook company where they're looking at games and using their game design resources to create, in this case, a halfway decent nutrition game. Get it from a game developer. Who would have thought? Blitz Games, they do a number of major games. They did the original version of Fusion Frenzy for the original Xbox. This is a medical trainer they did for their combat medicine group in their Ministry of Defense. And we'll just go through one last thing. In terms of marketing and culture, I think it's interesting. We see AverGames, billboards in games, product placement in games. I think the richer sort of outgrowth of this from a serious perspective is just brand association.
哎，越要惹火就越热卖，明白吗？
This is in China, obviously.
不要，
Where they
不要什么意思？
不要，就是不要。
Okay, we've drifted a long way from learning, right? But I'm sorry, when Coca-Cola shows up, then something has really happened. Something has definitely happened. I mean, Coca-Cola is a brand that doesn't make decisions, doesn't take their own decisions lightly. They're a very serious company when it comes to marketing. The fact that they're using World of Warcraft as their brand association in a huge market for them, I think sends a very clear message in a way that has brought us across that gamut, that there is something going on with games besides just the purpose of entertainment. It may be connected to that very, very core aspect. Games are fun. They're great places to spend time. They're incredible pieces of technology and social engineering. But this to me is a sort of a key tipping point sign to people to sort of start broadening their perspective, because when Coca-Cola can do it, I think a lot of people can do it. I've got plenty of stuff on the slides that will be given out, including some conclusions. There's just so much to talk about in this space, I think. I'm really glad to have had your time. Thank you. I'll take questions. Overloaded? Yeah.
In one of the slides, you went over it quite fast. It
Yeah,
said
sure.
Some of the serious things that gamers do, and one of the things was sometimes turn games into work. Could you just expand?
Yeah, so I'm in a guild in World of Warcraft, right? And I got named an officer of my guild. And one day I get this message saying, show up for the weekly officer meeting. And the meeting is on TeamSpeak, and we're on there. And I'm just new to this, right? I was very helpful in the guild, so they saw me as someone who would spend time, sucker, right? And we're on there, and they're like, so what do you think of this guy? You think he'll be good for next week's run? And it's like literally it was a human resources meeting. It was work. My wife walked into the room and heard this, right? Heard the chatter, and she's like, are you on a conference call? And I said to myself, I said, yeah, I am. And so there are people who go into these worlds and they actually earn enough gold in the world, and then they go and they sell it online, right? And they actually earn a living based on the disparity of cost of living. 500 gold pieces in the U.S. is worth a day's work or a week's work in China. I mean, this is documented fact, and so these are people who are actually earning a living in some of these games. Constance Steinkuhler at the University of Wisconsin actually did a sort of ethnographic map of the tools that a guild leader needed. So, like, they had a spreadsheet with everybody's name and what their alias was and their actual offline email. They had a calendar that they were maintaining. They had a website that they were maintaining. They had training runs. They literally, this was like a sort of, imagine a 16-year-old person playing a game like Lineage, which has these very, very big raids that go on. I mean, where you have to coordinate 100, 150 people. You're even IMing people saying, what are you doing right now? We're going. What do you mean you're at work? Stop. Get online. And if you spread all those applications and how they looked and how they were working, and you just put the game in the middle and you took the game away, you'd be like, what are they doing? And everybody would be like, oh, that's work. But they were playing. So there's a startup, Seriosity, that is taking some of these ideas, and they're doing a sort of thing where they're adding virtual currency because they see that as a big aspect to how these games work in terms of virtual currency sort of becomes like a social currency, and there becomes the ability to have these sort of open markets in games and for things like various virtual items, and they're turning that into a new way to sort of create better context in email. So if I send you an email with 100 gold pieces attached to it, you really want those gold pieces? Well, then you should pay attention to that email. Then you can then use those. You might be somebody who amasses gold. Now I can start to look at actual new organization charts. And it's not a game, but they're pulling these ideas from what they've observed by guild behaviors in massively multiplayer games. The project that I showed you at the very, very beginning, way up here, through everything because I don't know how to page up. This project that we were looking at with UAVs, we were looking at it first, they were just sort of like looking at it as a what-if environment. When we started thinking about how it would actually be used, we decided that the way this could work is it could be the training environment, the work environment, the what-if environment. It could be everything. It just was a matter of flipping what mode you were in. So, I mean, shades of Ender's Game, so to speak. Because think about it, less politically charged than UAVs flying over a country. Think of this as, say, RFID tags tagged to all of the equipment in an open pit mine. Now, I bring that up not because of recent events, but because literally I had somebody ask me about that. And we talked about the idea that once you put sensors on things and you pull them away and you put somebody in a room, what are you effectively doing? You're abstracting their knowledge of the environment and giving them a representative version upon which they can game. Because to them, they're just objects moving on a screen that they control. They're not necessarily real people in that sense. And where do people spend a lot of time moving objects around in real time trying to build strategic thought and purpose and achieve things, right? Well, Command and Conquer, Age of Empires. So how could those things be the new sort of logistical control environments in terms of where you're getting and building those skills? A kid who grew up playing Command and Conquer coming into this sort of, hi, you're going to be in charge of safety at the open pit mine, and here's your interface. And this kid's going to go and say, if it's developed that way, say, oh, this is just like Command and Conquer. In fact, we might even map the keys the same way. We might even map the menus and the modes and the way you select units. Oh, I'll select all these units by dragging this, and then I will give a build order. And then literally in that truck, the computer screen comes up, and there it says drive to, they don't know it's connected to this sort of environment. So it should be that natural progression, because where are they going to have picked up that skill? Probably in playing those same games, that same interface. That culture of interface will rob and steal and put to use in new and effective ways.
In the professional development space, so I'm hearing a lot about Second Life being used as a training tool where...
Sure.
And is that sort of a one-off thing, or is there some viability to that?
Well, I think that what Second Life has done is basically just created a very good open environment for streaming, networked, 3D, where you can actually build while you're in the world. A lot of the traditional massively multiplayer games, you can't walk around and reshape World of Warcraft, right? So they've done this sort of first really usable version of what we might think of as a metaverse type thing. And of course, so as a platform, and the fact that there is some audience, where we're having these huge disputes over what the real audience of Second Life is, it at least create a great experimental platform. And there are people sort of finding things that work and things that don't. I think as is true with most sort of pioneers, the arrows will get in the back and somebody will kind of see what they've done wrong perhaps and we'll do a new iteration. I mean, there are problems with the fact that in Second Life you are in this whole open world, whereas I might want my own walled version and an island isn't good enough. But I think that what IBM is trying to do, besides get some mind share on that space with their customers and branding, is in terms of the fact that they've been very vocal about Second Life, is they're sort of like, we need to get in and start learning now. I mean, the rules are not written, and we really don't even know what they are. And the best way to experience them maybe is to start trying some of these things. But will Second Life be that answer in and of itself? I'm not entirely sold on that. So I think they're still searching, in fact, for their own killer app in some ways. Yeah. Ross.
By the way, I heard that IBM they announced a dress code for their employees in Second Life.
Mm-hmm. Right. So again, so think. I mean, there's a takeaway from.
I've heard about IBM, but I've
hearing it more in ASTD. Certain
Right.
things.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people in like the Sloan Consortium, which is another e-learning consortium, looking at it, and they're looking at trying to think about what does it mean to have a classroom online in that space. And I mean, so far what you see are a lot of these sort of basic classrooms, and they're trying to decide if seeing an avatar version of me lecturing to a group of you sitting, but sitting on a screen, is of use. You know, here's an answer to that. To me, I don't understand it. I don't see it as necessarily an incredibly productive environment. There's somebody who's built an Asperger's island where being able to experiment in a 3D world with proximity was important because people who suffer from Asperger's actually do have social proximity skills that they have trouble with. And so he actually has found some evidence that in an environment like that there is great things. So this is really what we're dealing with, which we will be dealing with Second Life, and we will be dealing with everything else like it for a while. Is this, where does this actually work? And the fact that we don't quite know is why we're going to see a lot of noise, which is what we're seeing in serious games as well.
So the question I had, so you talked about like World of Warcraft, and you pull out the game and it's work.
Right.
How do you go the other way, where you got work going on and you
Sure.
have the game in the middle?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue, the thing that just comes to mind most there is this sort of immediacy of response by the interface, and how can you actually embed things from games. You might just steal components of things like leaderboards, things like instant feedback, just taking those sort of design cues. Contextual interfaces, right? You know, the new ribbon bar in Microsoft Office, right? Ribbon bars, things that change, non-standard interfaces that completely reconfigure based upon the situational context that the user's in. I mean, hello? Most strategic video games have been doing that for years, right? So is there a source there? And I think as we start to glom those types of things together and sort of look at what fits about play and work together and how we can create computer interfaces to it, going back to that sense of when the computer came along and really made single-player gaming possible. So there are companies that do all kinds of game-like motivations at work. But how can we use the computer and the interface where work is increasingly happening to create richer, better versions of that, better arbitrated versions, better displayed versions? And this is what game designers work on every day. So how do you work with them to sort of see if they give you that one extra or one original great idea that allows you to launch that kind of idea? I think that's what Seriosity is doing. I think they're trying to be influenced by it, not necessarily going out and trying to build a new game. Thank you.
Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.